Somewhere in Central Europe, 13 million people speak a language that has almost nothing in common with the languages spoken around them. Not French, not German, not Slavic. Their closest linguistic relatives live over 2,500 miles away, in small hunting communities scattered across the forests of western Siberia. And yet, if you swabbed the cheek of an average Hungarian today and ran their DNA, the results would come back looking almost identical to their Austrian, Slovak, and Croatian neighbors. That's the puzzle. A language with an Eastern homeland sitting inside a body that is, genetically, almost entirely European. For more than a century, this contradiction has haunted historians, linguists, and geneticists. Some tried to explain it away, others built entire ideologies on top of it. And only in the last few years, with new ancient DNA technology, hundreds of newly sequenced skeletons, and one landmark 2025 study out of Harvard, has the real answer started to come into focus. It isn't the answer most people expect. It's stranger, and in some ways more revealing about how history actually works. So let's start where the mystery starts, with a people whose ancestors' story splits in two. For centuries, Hungarians told a proud origin story. They believed they were the direct descendants of the Huns, the nomadic warriors who terrified the late Roman Empire under Attila. Hungarian noble families traced their lineage back to Attila's bloodline. Chronicles written in the Middle Ages described the Magyars, the ancestors of modern Hungarians, as the returning kinsmen of the Hunnic Empire, coming back centuries later to reclaim the Carpathian Basin. It's a great story. It's also, according to the genetic and archaeological evidence gathered so far, almost certainly not literally true, at least not in the direct, unbroken bloodline sense the legend describes. But before we get to why, we need to understand what linguists figured out roughly 200 years ago, because it completely rewrote how people thought about Hungarian origins. In the 19th century, philologists comparing vocabulary and grammar across Eurasia noticed something odd. Hungarian wasn't related to Latin, Germanic, or Slavic languages at all. Its true relatives were Finnish and Estonian, and even more closely, two small language communities almost nobody outside academia has heard of. Khanty and Mansi, spoken by indigenous communities living along rivers in western Siberia. Together, Hungarian, Khanty, and Mansi form what's called the Ugric branch of the Uralic language family. This discovery triggered a backlash. Many 19th century Hungarians didn't want to hear that their closest linguistic cousins were small Siberian communities, instead of the glamorous Huns of legend. A rival movement, sometimes called Turanism, insisted Hungarians were really descended from Central Asian steppe warriors, Huns, Turks, Scythians, and that the Uralic language connection was a technicality that didn't reflect real ancestry. That argument, remarkably, is still alive today in some corners of Hungarian nationalist thought. So, which is it? Are Hungarians the genetic descendants of Siberian hunter-fisher populations who happen to speak a related language? Steppe warriors from Central Asia? Or something else entirely? This is exactly the kind of question modern DNA analysis was built to answer, and answering it requires understanding a few tools first. When geneticists study ancestry, they look at several different kinds of evidence inside our cells. Autosomal DNA is inherited from both parents and reflects a broad mix of ancestry from every branch of your family tree. It's the best tool for understanding a population's overall genetic makeup. Y chromosome DNA passes only from father to son, so it tracks a single, unbroken paternal line back through history. Mitochondrial DNA does the same thing, but through mothers, passed down the maternal line. And when scientists extract these markers from skeletons, hundreds or thousands of years old, they're doing ancient DNA analysis. Reading the actual genetic code of people who lived through the events, historians can only describe secondhand. Each of these tools tells a different part of the story, and for Hungarians, they tell very different stories from each other, which is exactly why this case is so interesting. To understand what happened, we need the historical backdrop. Written sources describe a confederation of tribes, 7 core Hungarian tribes, plus a group called the Kabars, who broke away from the Khazar Khaganate, migrating westward from the Volga-Ural steppe region during the 9th century. Around 895 to 907 AD, under the leadership of Almos and his son Arpad, these tribes crossed the Carpathian Mountains and took control of the Carpathian Basin, the fertile, mountain-ringed heartland where Hungary sits today. They weren't moving into an empty land. The Carpathian Basin was already home to Slavic farming communities and the remnants of the Avar Khaganate, a nomadic empire that had dominated the region for over 2 centuries before collapsing a few decades earlier. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests the incoming Magyar conquerors didn't wipe out these existing populations. They conquered them, ruled over them, and eventually absorbed them. That detail matters enormously because it sets up the central genetic question. If the Magyars were a relatively small conquering group settling among a much larger existing population, how much of their DNA would you expect to find in Hungarians today? And does what we actually find match that expectation? This is where ancient DNA studies of the conquest period cemeteries become critical. Because for the first time, scientists aren't just studying modern Hungarians and guessing backward. They're reading the genomes of the conquerors themselves, buried where they fell more than 1,000 years ago. Multiple research teams have now sequenced DNA from Hungarian conquest period burial sites, cemeteries dated to the late 9th and 10th centuries. The results are striking. Y chromosome analysis of male individuals from these elite conqueror graves revealed at least 7 different paternal haplogroups, including lineages associated with East Asian and Central Asian populations, alongside others typical of Europe. That's not a genetically uniform group. It's a patchwork, consistent with a tribal confederation that had absorbed different peoples during its long migration across the steppe. Mitochondrial DNA from the same conqueror period burials told a similar story on the maternal side, a mixture of West Eurasian lineages and lineages more typical of Central and North Eurasia. One large-scale study analyzing more than 100 conqueror period metagenomes found their closest genetic connections weren't with Siberia in general, but specifically with populations ancestral to the Volga Tatars, pointing toward the Volga River region as a major staging ground before the Magyars ever reached Europe. And in 2022, a whole genome study of Hun, Avar, and Hungarian conquest period remains, sampling hundreds of individuals across all 3 migration waves, found that the elite core of each group carried substantial ancestry from Inner Asia, with no significant recent European ancestry mixed in. In other words, the people leading these migrations really were, genetically, relative newcomers to Europe. The old legend wasn't built from nothing. There really was a Central Asian dimension to the Hungarian conquest. So far, this seems to confirm the dramatic version of the story. Asian conquerors, riding out of the steppe, subduing Central Europe. But here's where researchers found something that didn't fit the simple narrative, something that fundamentally reshapes how we should think about identity itself. When you look at modern Hungarians, not the conquest period elite, but the roughly 10 million people living in Hungary today, their genetic profile looks almost nothing like those East Eurasian-influenced conquerors. Multiple independent studies using autosomal DNA, Y chromosome data, and mitochondrial DNA have all reached the same conclusion. The present-day Hungarian gene pool closely resembles that of their non-Uralic-speaking neighbors, Austrians, Slovaks, Croatians, Romanians, far more than it resembles Finns, Estonians, or the Khanty and Mansi communities that share their language family. One of the clearest signals of this comes from the Y chromosome haplogroup N, a paternal lineage strongly associated with the spread of Uralic languages across northern Eurasia. It shows up at meaningful frequencies in Finns, Estonians, and Siberian Uralic-speaking groups. Among modern Hungarians, researchers have found it is virtually absent. A 2018 genome-wide study of Uralic-speaking populations, published in Genome Biology, put it plainly. Unlike almost every other Uralic-speaking group studied, Hungarians and Estonians show no long-range genetic ties to their linguistic relatives that distinguish them from their non-Uralic neighbors. Think about what that actually means. The genetic marker most closely tied to the spread of the Uralic language family, the very language Hungarians speak, is nearly gone from the Hungarian gene pool. The language survived. The ancestry that supposedly carried it did not, at least not in any dominant way. There is one faint thread connecting modern Hungarians back to their linguistic homeland, and it's almost eerie in how narrow it is. Researchers studying a specific subclade of haplogroup N called N3A4 found it present in small numbers among modern Hungarians, and traced its closest relatives to populations living near the Ural Mountains today, including the Khanty and Mansi, Hungarians' closest linguistic cousins. The shared branch point in this lineage's family tree was estimated to go back 4,000 to 5,000 years, matching the approximate era when linguists believe the Ugric languages began splitting apart. It's a genuine genetic echo of the Uralic homeland, just an incredibly quiet one, buried under everything that came after. So now we have a real contradiction sitting on the table. Ancient conqueror period elites carrying substantial Inner Asian ancestry. Modern Hungarians looking essentially like their Central European neighbors, a language that firmly belongs to a family whose genetic homeland lies thousands of miles to the east. For a long time, researchers could describe this pattern, but they couldn't fully explain why it happened this way or trace it back to its ultimate origin. That changed very recently. In 2025, a team working with ancient DNA pioneer David Reich at Harvard published new research in the journal Nature that finally identified where the Uralic language family, and by extension, part of the Hungarian story, actually began. By analyzing over 1,000 ancient DNA samples spanning 11,000 years of Eurasian history, including newly sequenced genomes from Siberia, the team found a distinctive genetic signature that first appears in unmixed form in human remains from Yakutia, a remote region of northeastern Siberia, dating back roughly 4,500 years. That signature then shows up in progressively diluted form across the historical range of Uralic-speaking peoples as their languages spread westward over the following millennia. Here's the detail that matters most for Hungary specifically. Across most Uralic-speaking populations today, this ancient Siberian genetic signal survives more strongly in the Y chromosome, the direct paternal line, than in the rest of the genome, because it kept getting diluted generation after generation through intermarriage with surrounding populations, while father-to-son lineages preserved a thinner, more stubborn trace. But in Hungary, the researchers found something even more extreme. Almost no trace of this ancestry survives at all in any part of the genome. According to the study's authors, this makes Hungary a textbook example of what's called an elite dominance event, a scenario where a relatively small, politically powerful group imposes its language on a much larger existing population without leaving much of a genetic footprint. The incoming Magyar elite, according to this model, held enough military and political power to make their language stick, but they were probably never numerous enough and didn't intermix widely enough to reshape the broader gene pool of the region they conquered. Over the following centuries, as the local population overwhelmingly outnumbered the conquerors and continued marrying within the existing Carpathian Basin communities, the genetic signal of the original Uralic-speaking migrants was essentially diluted into the background, while the language itself, tied to power, prestige, and political identity, survived largely intact. It's a strange kind of survival, not through population replacement, but through the specific mechanism of dominance commanding the elite, the court, the administration, while everything else, from farming villages to family bloodlines, stayed rooted in populations who had already been living in the Carpathian Basin for centuries or millennia before the Magyars ever arrived. And if that sounds like an unusual one-off event in history, it isn't. The same researchers point to a modern parallel that most viewers will immediately recognize. Millions of Americans today speak English as their first language without having any English ancestry at all. Language and genetic ancestry are not the same thing, and they never have been. They travel together sometimes and completely diverge at other times, depending on how power, migration, and intermarriage actually played out on the ground. There's still plenty scientists don't fully understand here. Exactly how much of the original Magyar conqueror population was absorbed into the Carpathian Basin's existing communities versus how much simply never grew large relative to them remains debated. The precise size of the original conquering group is not known with certainty. Estimates from historical and archaeological sources vary widely, and DNA alone can't give an exact head count. And researchers are still working out the finer regional differences in ancestry across Hungary today, since not every community absorbed the same mix of Avar, Slavic, and conqueror ancestry in the same proportions. But the big picture, built from ancient genomes, Y chromosome lineages, mitochondrial DNA, and now the deep Siberian origin point of the Uralic languages themselves, is about as clear as population genetics gets. The Hungarian conquerors really did arrive from the Volga-Ural steppe region carrying genuine Inner Asian and Uralic ancestry, exactly as linguists predicted based on the language alone. But rather than that ancestry spreading through the population they conquered, it was the language that spread, carried by political dominance rather than demographic replacement, while the genetic profile of the people speaking it gradually became indistinguishable from their Central European neighbors. So when someone tells you the shocking truth about Hungarian DNA is that Hungarians are secretly Asian or secretly nomadic warriors from the steppe, the actual science tells a more interesting story than that. Modern Hungarians carry the deep genetic imprint of the populations who lived across the Carpathian Basin long before the Magyars ever crossed the mountains. Avars, Slavs, and the layers of European prehistory beneath them. What the Magyars left behind wasn't primarily written in DNA. It was written in grammar, in vocabulary, in a language that has now outlived the empire, the tribes, and the bloodline that carried it here, surviving instead in the mouths of 10 million people who, genetically, mostly descend from someone else entirely. That's the real story hiding behind the paradox, not a hidden bloodline, but proof that identity, language, and ancestry are three different threads, and history doesn't require them to match.